It's time to talk about some of the most enigmatic of all the Nordic gods, the ones who call no clan their own, but stand apart. These are the others. Many bodies of myth have deities who dwell on the boundaries or even outside of the society formed by the gods of that particular mythos. Sutekh, often rendered as Set in the English-speaking world, of the Egyptian gods is one common example. Another is Hecate, of the Greek gods, one who is described as having tremendous power, yet stands apart from the Olympians. The Nordic gods are no exception to this, and have their own deities who are apart and removed from the broader societies of gods that exist within Nordic myth. What makes the exclusion of the others, which is a term that I use to describe these deities, noteworthy is the fact that within the Nordic myth, there are three major groups of deities that exist. The Aesir, the gods of society, the Vanir, the gods of the liminal, and the Jotnar, the gods of the wilderness, who I've done a more extended breakdown on, mostly because there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings around the Jotnar's role within Nordic cosmology. I've got a link to that particular episode in the show description. The others represent even more primordial and fundamental powers than those embodied by the Aesir, Vanir, and Jotnar. Among their number, you find the arbiters of time and weird, the caretaker of the dead, the bound and that which shapes boundaries, as well as the keeper of the most terrible of truths within all of the heathen cosmos. What also makes the others different from the main groups of Nordic gods is how they don't really seem to form their own particular shared culture. They are simply those who stand apart, those who do their own thing. The strange wise one who eschews village or city life and instead dwells at the edge of what is recognized as being part of society while possessing enormous wisdom. One figure who I do not count as being part of the others is Angerboda, the Troll Queen. And don't worry, she and hers are going to be getting their due later on this podcast. In this explainer, I'm going to get into who these particular powers are, what sets them apart in a bit more detail from the other groups of gods, and then from there, what it is they represent. So let's take it away. Who are the others? This disparate, not exactly organized and more sort of created out of shared relationship body of deities are, as I said before, set apart from the rest of the gods. They don't even really seem to have particularly strong relations with each other. Even the children of Loki, which is to say Hela, Fenrir, and Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, don't really seem to have, at least depicted in myth, close relations. Now, this could be because they don't really see eye to eye with one another. It could also be a product of that each of them are quite isolated from each other within the cosmos based on the functions that they fulfill and the roles that they play. It's sort of hard to know because, again, when we're getting into the others, we're talking figures that are really at the edges of description. If there's very limited material on who the Vanir were, as shown by the short list of names that we get from Snorri Sturluson, as well as descriptions, but not much really in the way of myth or stories, then the others are very much at the edges, and also by implication, a very select few. I want to stress again, this is not a group that should be seen as being like a clan or tribe within the Nordic divine world. These figures are, as I mentioned before, the children of Loki, the Norns, the great dragon Nidhogg, who gnaws endlessly at the roots of the world tree, as well as the nameless eagle, which dwells in the peak of the canopy of the world tree, and the nameless Cirrus. Though this certainly is a category that could expand depending on what is uncovered or demonstrated within source material. Now, the fact that they don't form into a society or kind of shared association on their own is something that I think is very noteworthy. Within the Nordic world, at least when we're talking the late Iron Age, the period leading up to what is popularly known as the Viking Age, and the period shortly after, society was how you survived. I know I've gotten into this a bit before, but it bears repeating that living in medieval Scandinavia in the Nordic regions of the peninsula was a very hard life. Arable land was limited. Commerce was heavily dependent on access to waterways, which meant during the winter months, a lot of shipping, which included things like vital food products, literally froze in place. A bad harvest could mean the difference between survival and starvation. So could epidemics, war, any number of other misfortunes that could befall people living in what's already a pretty marginal part of the world during this time period. It's not for nothing that one common theory that you'll see when you're reading about the history of this period is that the population explosion which took place leading up to the Viking Age was in part thanks to the invention of iron plows that could dig much deeper and make much more land open to farming and cultivation. Being removed from society was not quite a death sentence, but pretty well understood as such. And it was also a punishment that was leveled against murderers, serious oath breakers, and other people who were seen as simply too dangerous to keep around within organized, settled society. This meant that anyone who could survive without these essential supports for being able to stay alive from harvest to harvest and year to year would have to be someone who was extremely formidable in terms of their knowledge, their wealth, their abilities, or whatever else it was that allowed them to make a living outside of the supports of farmed, fished, and trading lands. What especially emphasizes this is how within the history of the Nordic world we have examples of these exiles going off to do a number of things, like become part of the greater world that was the Viking culture, which is a thing that will be its own podcast at some point, I promise, or seeking out new lands and new possibilities, like Eric the Red famously did within Iceland and then later Greenland. Historically, exiles founded new societies or embedded themselves within different societies within the Nordic world who were willing to accept them despite being outcasts. Mythically, the only beings that really dwell apart like this so much are those who are obsessed with revenge, like the dwarf Reagan, the dragons Fafnir, and the one who appears in Beowulf, and other similar beings, including, for example, exceptionally dangerous and powerful berserkers who have been cast out from society. So, who are these beings? In a bit more detail. Well, first, we have, as I mentioned before, the children of Loki. Hela, the corpse goddess, Fenrir, the wolf god, and Jormungandr, the great serpent. All three are the children of Loki by way of Angerboda, the troll queen, sometimes also called the mother of monsters. Hela and Jormungandr, shortly after their emergence, were cast out, according to Snorri, physically hurled to the furthest reaches of the cosmos. Where Hela landed became Helheim, the realm of the dead, or at least those who die of what is called a straw death, where the cause of death is old age, injury, or sickness. Linguistically, Hela's name is closely connected with other words that are associated with the grave. There also doesn't seem to be any particular implication of going to Hela and Helheim as being especially shameful compared to other ways of dying. Hela herself is described as half corpse and half alive, with her corpse half being rotted and decrepit, while her living half often described as beautiful. Which half is which depends on the artist. In most depictions that I've seen of Hela, she's usually split down the middle, in a fashion that's almost reminiscent of Harlequin-style jesters. Though I have seen in the comic series Bratthalla, Hela depicted as having her living half from the waist up and her corpse half from the waist down. Regardless of how one depicts it, Hela, being described as being halfway between life and death, very much embodies her place as being a goddess of the grave and a keeper and tender of the dead. Her brothers have even more extraordinary appearances. Jormungandr is a massive serpent, which is said to be so long that it encircles all of Midgard, thus creating the boundaries and limits that hold up physical reality as we know it. It is argued by some heathens that the exact moment when Midgard takes on this role is during the Heimsvidka, an Eddic saga where Thor goes fishing, and along the way, while using an ox's head as bait, manages to snare Jormungandr. And during that moment, instead of cutting the bait loose, at least initially, Thor takes his hammer and nails Jormungandr's jaws to Jormungandr's tail, thus creating a great loop encircling Midgard. This is also said to be where the great feud between these two powers begins, a feud that will only be resolved at Ragnarok, where Thor and Jormungandr will wrestle to their mutual demise, as Thor only takes 9 steps from defeating the great serpent before succumbing to his wounds. Fenrir is the third of the children of Loki, and the one who is probably the most complicated in terms of what he represents and what he's associated with. Fenrir, of all the 3 children of Loki, was the only one who was truly fostered within Asgard by the god Tyr, who is described as being the only one who was brave enough to care for and raise the young pup. As Fenrir grew, the wolf became massive, and along with their size grew their appetite, until it was said that Fenrir could open their jaws and the bottom would scrape the earth while the top reached the edge of the sky, able to swallow all in between. It was this prodigious power and appetite that inspired the gods to plot against Fenrir and bind the great wolf. The gods had the dwarves make 3 different chains that were said to bind the wolf. The first 2, made from steel and then stone, were easily broken. And so the dwarves stretched their creativity to make a chain that was forged from 6 impossible things. And the moment these things were used to make the chain, they were removed from the world forever. These were the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of women, the roots of mountains, the sinews of bears, the breath of fish, and the spittle of birds. The case of Fenrir is one that is really messy and complicated, which I've gotten into before in quite a few different places, including my book, The Way of Fire and Ice. While on one hand, the fear the gods have of Fenrir's boundless potential appetite is one that fits with a general pattern that you see throughout Nordic myth. The villains are often those who hoard or consume resources far beyond what is their appropriate share and to the detriment of those who are around them, while the heroes are often those who defy and defeat these villains, take the resources they've been hoarding, and share it with the community. On the other hand, Fenrir was a foster son of Tyr. Fosterage was a practice that has some similar echoes and parallels in places like the Roman world and among the Gaelic groups of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and essentially represented a sort of kind of adoption, that someone who was your foster son was effectively your son. And this was a tool that was used for establishing and maintaining diplomatic relations between different groups. Betraying one's own kin is one of those things that's strongly frowned upon within Nordic myth and these societies. So while on one hand, you could say the gods had something of a case that Fenrir was a problem, on the other, they didn't really go about addressing the problem in a way that was consistent with the ethics and morals of their time, place, and community. One could argue that maybe Fenrir was an extraordinary exception, or that Fenrir was a victim of circumstance and prejudice. It sort of depends on where you sit. And one of the things that complicates the whole question is how Fenrir swears upon the moment of being bound that he will devour Odin whole at Ragnarok. So again, while on one hand, Fenrir is a sworn enemy of one of the most well-known and influential of the Aesir, but on the other, maybe within the context of how the Nordic peoples understood vengeance, he's not wrong. It's one of those things about Nordic myth. It doesn't always have nice, clear lines with good and evil wearing convenient white and black hats. Next, we have the Norns, the 3 great giant maids described within the Voluspo as emerging from the darkness following the creation of Midgard, Asgard, and the rest of the 9 worlds, who then are said to be marking the time, the lengths of lives, and the fates allotted to all within the 9 worlds. Their names are Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld. That which was, is becoming, and shall be, as a consequence of what was and is becoming. The great 3 Norns don't really show up within Nordic myth. And this is something that I think is very important. When I say don't show up, what I mean is there's no real examples of other gods going before the Norns, seeking their favor, seeking their wisdom, guidance, whatever. There are instances within Greek myth, such as, for example, one case where Apollo gets the Moirai, who are sort of the Greek equivalent, the three spinners who draw out the lives of men and then cut them short, to get drunk and spare someone who is especially favored by Apollo. There really isn't anything like that in Nordic myth. And I think that's something that's very significant, at least within surviving myth, because we have gods like Odin and Loki who regularly, sort of their hats, if you will, defy boundaries and expectations, disregard clearly posted signs that say thou shalt not pass. And they don't mess with the Norns. No one really seems to. When they come forth in the Völuspá, and this is as the gods are ordering reality, putting the sun and the moon in the heavens, telling the stars their place, raising the mountains, building continents out of the remains of Ymir, and all those other amazing feats of creation, the Norns simply come forth and lay claim to their supreme place in the cosmos as setting weird and direction and time for all beings without so much as a moment's discussion or dissent. No one's described as going, well, wait a minute, what gives you the right to do this? Or who are you to claim this supreme position, this incredible place of influence over all of the 9 worlds and all reality in between? This is especially noteworthy because for anyone who's gone through the Nordic myth, democratic institutions, councils, and assemblies where debate and discussion and resolution, these are things that are all over the place. It's even in the Völuspá of not just crafting the different parts of reality, but also when Ragnarok comes, what do the gods do in the face of crisis? They hold council one last time to decide what will be done. They don't simply look to Odin to invoke emergency powers or something like that. They still return to the Ting to figure out what to do next. So for the Norns to simply say, this is ours, and we're just going to do this, is significant. These are beings whose influence is beyond that of all the other gods. And there is also the whole hierarchy of lesser Norns, which I get into in the episode about Weird, which you can also find a link to in the show notes below. They are apart and incredibly influential. This then brings me to the nameless Cirrus. Now, this is an entity that is not counted by many different forms of Nordic practice as being among the gods. However, I think she is someone who is worth including as such for one simple reason. She is a being that Odin must seek out wisdom from. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, the nameless Cirrus is the entity who Odin summons forth from the grave, using undescribed yet clearly powerful sorcery to compel this being to give testimony, first to answer the question of what will happen to Balder, and then in more detail to describe the horrors of Ragnarok. It's important to note that in both these sagas, this figure clearly describes herself as being pulled forth from the grave. We also don't know what kind of Cirrus she is. We don't know if she is possibly a deceased Jotun or a deceased deity of another group. We don't know if she's human or an Alf or what have you. We just know that she's dead. And there's something about her being dead that gives her a particular insight, which even Odin and Frigg do not possess. Speaking personally for a moment, in terms of what few encounters are that I've had with this power, she is the mysteries and the answers which you know are true and unavoidable, but also are ones you are not prepared to face and must be confronted with. I even suspect the fact that she had to be forced by Odin's sorcery to speak says something about both her wisdom and her place within the cosmos. She chooses to remain in the ground and must be forced to come forth. This then brings me to the final two of the others. These are Nidhogg, the great devourer in the roots of the world tree, and the nameless eagle above. Nidhogg down below we know a bit more about, because Nidhogg's domain is described as the well of Vergelmir, one of the three wells which feeds into the world tree. Those who dwell there are said to be, to quote from the Bellows translation of the Voluspo for a minute, in part because he does have a good poetic ring to it, murderers, oath breakers, and workers of ill. People who in life would have been cast out of their respective societies, and I strongly suspect are forced to evade Nidhogg's hunger until such a time as the dragon devours them, because none of the rest of the dead will have them. I think it would be safe to say that any Nazi who followed orders is here. Really, I guess you could say anyone who is prey for the great devourer was probably awful in life. Above, we have the nameless eagle, who we know very little of. There is said to be a hawk named Vörðurfólnir, who sits between the eyes of this eagle and is said to speak for and see for it. And his name means storm pale or wind bleached. But we don't know very much about Vörðurfólnir, the eagle, or those who dwell in the greatest canopies of the world tree. There is also a little squirrel named Ratatosk who runs back and forth between Nidhogg and Vörðurfólnir, fueling a great feud between the two. Any resemblance to the site formerly known as Twitter is purely a coincidence, I'm sure. So what do all these beings have in common? As I said before, these are the powers primal. They represent deep and powerful forces which go beyond the gods. Hela, for example, is the one who will receive Balder when Balder, or after Balder, depending on how you interpret myth and its relationship to present day in terms of time and causality, dies. The Norns, Nidhogg, the Great Eagle, Jormungandr, and Fenrir are beyond the rest of the gods. Even the Aesir in their greatest might could not actually slay the wolf or the serpent, but only bind them into places within the cosmos where, hopefully, at least according to them, they would do no harm. And I think this is the common tie of the others. These are gods that are united not so much in having a shared sense of community, identity, and social norms, as they are in how they stand apart and represent those things which all the other gods fear. And that is this explainer on the others. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, this is Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about Radical Heathen Practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.